Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we look at great theories of everything in their entirety and try to, figure out the best way to use these things in our own lives, and maybe even how to put them together to synthesize many different theories of everything so that we can maybe get some kind of overarching even theory of everything. We've looked at primarily two so far. This is the 572nd video that we've done on the reciprocal system of theory from Dewey B. Larson. And we did many videos before that on the ancient Egyptian tree of life, especially as interpreted by Ra and Nefer Amen in Medunat Ter. And we're going to get into some other stuff here soon, but we're sticking with Dewey Larson's reciprocal system for right now. And Mr. Larson was an American engineer who lived in the 20th century. He died back in 1990, left behind many books, physics and chemistry and astronomy, but also he has books on metaphysics, a book on metaphysics, which includes sections on religion, psychology, philosophy, biology, even dream interpretation. And he has two books on economics. We're looking at one of those books today that is called The Road to Permanent Prosperity. Mr. Larson's theory of the reciprocal system is also known as the universe of motion. Larson was one of the few cosmologists to propose a universe based on motion. The universe is not made out of matter, it's not made out of energy or force or anything like that. The universe is made out of motion. And in fact, force, matter, energy, and every other scientific quantity is a form of motion. And they can all be expressed in terms exclusively made out of space and time. Motion, Larson's first postulate states that the universe is composed entirely of one component, motion, existing in 3 dimensions, in discrete units, and with 2 reciprocal aspects, space and time. And so motion is a fraction, with space or time as the numerator and time or space as the denominator. You can think of that in terms of speed. I was riding my bike at 20 miles per hour. 20 miles of space in 1 hour of time. Space over time is speed. And if you double the speed, you can either say I was going at 40 miles per hour, or you could say equivalently, I was going at 20 miles per half hour. You can double the space or halve the time, and both would give you the same result. That is a reciprocal relationship. But Larson spreads that out to all forms of motion, all of our scientific quantities, matter, energy, force, pressure, electric charge. They're all expressible in space-time terms, with the idea that space and time can have multiple dimensions. You can have acceleration, space over time to the second power, or force, time over space to the second power, or matter, time to the third power over space to the third power, or pressure, time over space to the fourth power, and so on and so forth. Now, when Larson applies this to economics, Um, well, first, he contends that the economic system is a system in motion and that it relies on two reciprocal aspects, production and consumption. And also you have some basic economic laws that we can't get around. Larson is quite opposed to the sociological school of economics, which is most of it, which is ideologically based, politically based, that people have certain political viewpoints and they try to propound those things through their economic philosophy. But Larson is really saying that you've got to set up your economic program in harmony with the physical laws. He proposes what he calls scientific economics, or what Ron Satz calls econophysics. And that is the first principle. You can deal with the other stuff, the ideological stuff, once you're sure that your economic system complies with the laws of physics. Anyway, I'm going to let Larson speak for himself. But if you'd like to go to the beginning of this book, go back about 6-7 weeks in the archives and start with chapter 1. And also, if you'd like to know more about the reciprocal system, I did about 474 videos where I explain it in a little bit more detail. So check out any or many of those, because they're all different, but they all have kind of an ad hoc explanation in them. Now, today we're going to check out chapter 22, or at least start chapter 22 of this book, The Road to Permanent Prosperity. And chapter 22 is called Dealing with Recessions. So this is going to be, Larson's approach to recessions. He's got a specific approach to deal with the boom and bust cycles of the economic system, which he says are, basically unavoidable, but they are kind of mitigatable. You can smooth out the amplitude, or dampen the amplitude of the boom and bust cycles, so that you have your economic system humming, and that you have basically permanent prosperity. It's always working pretty well, and there's no periods of scarcity. Okay, chapter 22, Dealing with Recessions. As pointed out in chapter 21, the principles and relations that were developed in the theoretical discussions in the early pages of this work specify distinctly and definitely just how stabilization of the economy can be accomplished, and it would be possible to proceed immediately with the identification of suitable practical measures for achieving the desired results. However, most of the measures that will be recommended are not new. They are included in one form or another among the multitude of proposals that have been offered in the past as solutions for the problem, or as contributions toward such a solution. It may not be immediately apparent, therefore, just where the conclusions of this work differ from their predecessors, or why the recommended measures can be expected to accomplish their purpose under the proposed new program when they have not done so in the past. For this reason, it seems advisable to discuss the various remedies for our economic ills that have previously been proposed, and to examine them in the light of the economic principles that have been developed in the foregoing pages. Some of the proposals that will be included in this review of previous ideas are so far out of the mainstream of economic thought that they may seem out of place in a serious discussion. But these proposals have been given serious consideration during past periods of economic stress, and in view of the lack of any accepted criterion of validity, it is quite probable that at least some of them will surface again when the economy once more runs into difficulties. From the results of this analysis, we will be able to appraise the merits of each proposal, and we will then check this theoretical evaluation against the results that have been obtained in actual practice. When we find, as we will, that the plans judged worthless on the basis of this appraisal have fizzled out without doing any appreciable good, that the proposals which have some sound points, according to our analysis, have been partially successful, and that the measures which we have identified as theoretically correct have been effective for their particular purposes to the extent that they have been correctly employed, this should put the findings of this work into the proper perspective. What we have done is not to devise any new tool for stabilization purposes, but to determine precisely what needs to be stabilized, how this stabilization can be accomplished, what contribution toward the defined objective each of the measures previously proposed can make if properly applied, and how the condition of the economy from the stability standpoint can be measured for control purposes. The essence of the new program is a clear recognition of just what should be controlled and the formulation of a procedure which will ensure that the control measures are applied in exactly the right direction at exactly the right time. In the discussion of measures previously utilized or advocated for this purpose, it will be brought out that some have failed or would fail if they were tried, because they contribute nothing toward the particular kind of action that is necessary, whereas other measures actually do have an effect on the business cycle and have failed wholly or partially in past applications only because they were applied without any clear understanding of what they were capable of doing, and without any adequate criterion by which to judge the magnitude of the action that should be taken. It was pointed out in Chapter 18 that the principal reason for studying the reaction of the world economies to wartime conditions is that operation under the stresses introduced by the diversion of civilian productive facilities to war production intensifies the problems of the normal economy and makes it easier to see their true nature. The situation with respect to economic stability is somewhat similar. We can see the reasons for instability and the effects of corrective measures most distinctly by viewing them under extreme conditions, specifically in a major depression, where all of the principal economic problems became serious enough to be clearly defined. The discussion that follows will therefore be addressed to the issue as to how to deal with a severe recession or depression, and will concentrate largely on experience during the Great Depression of the 1930s. The section is called Psychological Measures. Usually, one of the first expedients called upon in a time of difficulty is an attempt to change the psychological outlook by reassuring words from men in high places, In the early stages of the Depression of the 1930s, a flood of optimistic statements emanated from administration spokesmen and prominent business figures. But the decline continued on its way in cynical disregard of the eminence of these modern King Canutes. I do not know who King Canute is, but that's interesting. These reassurances are doomed to failure for two reasons. First, they fool no one. Those who suspect the worst are not going to change their opinions merely because some of those persons vitally interested in maintaining the status quo talk loudly about the fundamentally sound conditions. An even more significant point is that the condition of the money and credit reservoirs at the top of the upswing is abnormal and cannot be maintained except under the influence of a rising trend of prices and general business activity. Much of the borrowing has been for the purpose of taking advantage of rising price levels. Speculators, for instance, have no incentive to continue using borrowed funds if the market remains stationary. A change from a rising trend to a level trend therefore causes a substantial contraction in credit, an input into the credit reservoir, as well as a rise in money storage toward more normal levels. The diversions from the purchasing power stream to fill the reservoirs reduce the flow of purchasing power to the markets, not only to the equivalent of production, which would stabilize prices, but to a still lower level. This causes a drop in market prices, and the whole system starts down. There is no stationary condition in the absence of an effective control program. We jump directly from the upswing to the downswing. Unless the psychological campaign can convince the public that the rise is still going on, an obviously hopeless assignment, it does no good to convince them that there will be no decline, for the realization that the rise is over is sufficient in itself to start the decline. The decline must continue in an uncontrolled economy until the abnormal conditions in the reservoirs are corrected. If the situation at the peak is not much overbuilt, the drop is moderate and the repercussions are limited, though not without importance. If the peak is capped by speculative excesses, the fall is precipitous, and by the time the abnormal reservoir conditions are corrected, a further crisis is created by the increase in unemployment. We cannot talk ourselves out of this kind of a problem. Okay, now this is called buy now campaigns. Closely related to the proclaim optimism approach is the idea that the decline can be stopped by persuading the public to do more buying. But it is unrealistic to expect any substantial increase in consumer buying during a period of falling prices. And there is no incentive for an increase in business investment. To the extent that these two propaganda programs are convincing, they may have some effect in slowing the rate of decline. But the value of this achievement is questionable, to say the least. If we must have a depression, the sooner we get it over with, the better. This is called loans to industries and homeowners. In the 1930s depression, the government embarked on a program of making loans to distressed industries on a hitherto unprecedented scale. Similar help was extended to homeowners who were unable to meet their commitments. These loans, with relatively few exceptions, were not new credit, but merely devices to prevent the forced liquidation of existing credit. All they accomplished, from the standpoint of the system as a whole, was to slow up the process of refilling the credit reservoirs and thereby retard the speed of deflation. The loans were unquestionably helpful in minimizing individual distress, but they cannot be considered as contributing toward the restoration of normal business conditions. If we take a cold-blooded factual view of the situation and ignore the inequality of personal hardships, it is clear that, as long as the means that are available for controlling money inflation remain unrecognized by the monetary authorities, measures such as these loans actually stand in the way of the readjustments that are necessary before the trend of business can be reversed. Before a rise can begin, as matters now stand, liquidation of credit must proceed until the credit reservoirs are full enough to cause an outward pressure. Bankruptcies would hasten this process. Propping up tottering industries delays the readjustment and prolongs the depression. This does not mean that such a cold-blooded policy ought to be followed under such circumstances. From a humanitarian standpoint, we are no doubt justified in relieving individual distress at the expense of the interest of the community as a whole, but we should adopt remedial measures with our eyes open and not delude ourselves into thinking that they contribute toward the restoration of prosperity. The dilemma that we face here is one of the strong arguments in favor of setting up the kind of controls that will eliminate the cyclical swings. Okay, this section is called work spreading. Work spreading measures reduced hours per week, rotating employment, etc., are somewhat similar in that their primary effect is to reduce individual hardship. Analysis shows, however, that they do not retard recovery in the same manner as the loan programs just discussed. They simply do not affect the depressed business situation either one way or the other. The acceptance of the relief or welfare principle in recent years means that the effect of work sharing under present conditions is merely to reduce the amount of welfare expenditure, a result which has little bearing on the general economic situation. The basic question here is whether the burden of supporting the unemployed should be met by the taxpayers in general through welfare payments or by the employed workers through sharing their employment and earnings. In either case, the action is one which takes from one group of individuals and gives to another group. That is, it is a transaction between individuals at the same economic location. Hence, it has no significant bearing on the problem of economic stability, nor does either alternative make any contribution toward recovery from a depression. The effect of work-spreading policies on overall employment and economic growth was discussed in The Road to Full Employment, which is Larson's other book on economics. This section is called Welfare Payments. The severity of the unemployment during the 1930s depression, together with a developing sense of community responsibility for the economic status of individual citizens, resulted in general acceptance for the first time of the principle that those who are unable to find employment through no fault of their own are entitled to support by the community during their period of enforced idleness. The obvious equity of this policy will no doubt make it permanent until the need is eliminated by some such program as the one that will be developed in this work. The welfare payments have no direct effect on the general operation of the economic mechanism, although the method of obtaining the necessary funds to finance the payments may have, an issue that will be discussed later. They merely transfer purchasing power from one group of consumers, the taxpayers, to another, the recipients. A transaction between individuals at the same economic location. Consequently, they have no value as a control measure or as an anti-depression measure. Such transfers make the depression more endurable, but they do not contribute toward recovery. Furthermore, there are some indirect results that should be noted. The alleviation of distress, commendable as it may be from some standpoints, does have the effect of removing much of the pressure for positive action toward remedying the basic trouble. In short, it acts as a sedative to keep the patient quiet, but does nothing toward a cure. The influence of huge welfare rolls on the state of public confidence must also be given some serious consideration, or some consideration. In the previous discussion of business cycles, it was pointed out that recovery from a depression finally gets underway when the liquidation of debts and the accumulation of money reserve proceeds far enough that further inflow into the reservoirs encounters resistance, at which point even a small degree of optimism as to future prospects starts an outflow that reverses the cycle. There is no question but that large welfare expenditures have a dampening effect on business confidence and hence tend to prolong depressions. This section is called Unemployment Insurance. From a purely economic standpoint, unemployment insurance and welfare payments are equivalent. The foregoing discussion of welfare payments therefore applies, in general, to unemployment insurance as well. But the insurance programs are much more satisfactory to the workers because they eliminate, for the term of the insurance coverage, the uncertainties as to eligibility and as to the amount of payment. The scope of the insurance coverage is therefore being gradually extended. This section is called Subsistence Employment. Much of the same considerations apply to the various alternatives to welfare, mainly schemes for taking care of the unemployed, by assigning them to special types of work, by means of which they could earn a bare subsistence. Back to the farm movements, in the case of declining prices for farm products, self-help programs, and various more or less elaborate communal projects make up this class. An example of the last mentioned variety is a plan proposed during the 1930s Depression by Professor Frank Graham, who would have the government lease idle factories and other properties and put the unemployed to work producing goods that could be exchanged among themselves to take care of their essential needs. As pointed out by W.I. King, who was one of the supporters of Graham's plan, these enterprises would be very inefficient in comparison with ordinary producers, and the workers would have to put in long hours to obtain even a fraction of the rewards of normal employment. This fact was listed by King as one of the merits of the plan, inasmuch as it would ensure continued efforts by the participants to secure normal employment. But the general public attitude toward the victims of economic difficulties has undergone drastic changes since 1930. The same electorate, which has finally arrived at the point of recognizing the community responsibility for furnishing a living to those who have been deprived of the opportunity to earn it for themselves because of the defective operation of the economic system, will certainly realize that it is no different, except in degree, to impose the penalty of long hours and meager returns on those unfortunate victims of community incompetence. The fundamental weakness of all of these subsistence schemes, however, is that they are merely a cheap form of welfare assistance. They treat the symptoms of our economic illness after a fashion, but they do not touch the purchasing power unbalance that must be corrected before the business cycle can be reversed. Okay, this next section is called script, and let's try to knock out this paragraph here. Well, no, because it's getting into more script. Okay, we're going to stop right there, and we will get into the script and any other proposals that Mr. Larson wants to go through here in this chapter tomorrow. So thank you for tuning in today, and hope to see you tomorrow back at the same place. Have a great day.